Part 6, April 1775. Come, join hand in hand, brave Americans all, and rouse your bold hearts at fair liberty's call. No tyrannous act shall suppress your just claim, or stain with dishonor America's name. Our worthy forefathers, let's give them a cheer, to climates unknown did courageously steer. Through oceans to deserts for freedom they came, and dying, bequeathed us their freedom and fame. The tree their own hands had to liberty reared, they lived to behold growing strong and revered. With transport they cried, now our wishes we gain, for our children shall gather the fruits of our pain. Then join hand in hand, brave Americans all, by uniting we stand, by dividing we fall. In so righteous a cause let us hope to succeed, for heaven approaches of each generous deed. The Liberty Songs. Words set by patriot John Dickinson as a parody of the English song Heart of Oak. Chapter 20. Oh, to have been there, Nathaniel, Basil sighed, to have heard him. His words were so stirring that one of the men leaning through the window of the church to listen has requested to be buried underneath that window when he dies. Basil had wandered out to the stable to find Nathaniel to talk about Patrick Henry for about the 100th time. For the past weeks, the town had discussed little else than Henry's March 23rd speech to the Virginia Convention. The fiery Henry had demanded that the colony raise troops to defend itself in case Britain used military force to stop their protests. At first, he was dismissed. Despite the harsh occupation of Boston, despite the British warship anchored at Borwell's Landing just outside Williamsburg, leaders like Peyton Randolph stubbornly held on to the belief that reasonable legal arguments plus the trade embargo would convince the king to recognize American rights. But Henry wouldn't give up. He thundered that the colonists had done all they could to avoid fighting. They had petitioned, remonstrated, and prostrated themselves before the throne. Still, Parliament refused to listen and only sent navies and armies to suppress them. If we wish to be free, we must fight, he shouted. Basil had been to the Raleigh Tavern and heard bits and pieces of Henry's already legendary speech. They say no one stirred as Mr. Henry spoke. They hardly breathed, listening to him. Can you imagine having that kind of effect? It's the power of words, Nathaniel, the power of words. Never forget it. Nathaniel smiled as he brushed to pull away the horse's itchy, hot winter fur. Although his back was turned to Basil, he knew the old tutor's eyes were glossy with an awed rapture. Basil was like that about words. A man who'd witnessed it acted out Mr. Henry's speech. Mr. Henry said we must replace the illusion of hope with the lamp of experience. He went on, gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Then Mr. Henry slumped, with his hands crossed before him as if shackled, and cried out, Why stand we here idle? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! Mr. Henry held his arms up toward heaven like this. Basil reached for the sky and ended, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Basil pulled out each word of the last sentence like a drumbeat. He dropped his hands. Oh, Nathaniel, what a man! What a mind! What a speech! Somewhere during the course of Basil's description, Nathaniel had turned currycomb quiet himself, spellbound by Patrick Henry's dramatic call for action, just as Virginia's lawmakers had been. In the end, Henry's impassioned words pushed the Virginia Convention to muster 2 regiments of infantry. Everywhere, men were beginning to gather rifles, muskets, even Indian tomahawks to join up. Flushed with inspiration, Basil remained motionless, staring off into the air. The recruits will wear hunting shirts as uniforms at first. On those shirts, men are embroidering Henry's words, liberty or death. Think, Nathaniel, Those words will march straight into battle and be the banner that steadies men under fire. Those words may create a new nation, a nation of hope, of fairness, of equality." He lapsed into silence. Nathaniel turned back to the horse, but he too was lost in thought about the choice Patrick Henry was calling for, about the choice Moses and John Hunter had made, a chance that Obijah had taken as well on the very day that Patrick Henry stirred so many souls. Perhaps encouraged by John's escape, Obijah decided he also had had enough of Eden's tirades. Absent-mindedly, Nathaniel laid the currycomb on the horse's neck. It stamped its foot impatiently, waiting. Liberty or death? Is life so dear as to be purchased at the price of chains? What had happened to Moses when he was returned to his owner? Had John made it to liberty? There had been no word of him. Hopefully escape would be easier for him and for Obijah, men of the same skin color as European noblemen. When the poor Moses had fled, it had been easy to spot him. There were freed Africans in Virginia, yes, but they were few. Moses must have stood out like a comet in the night sky. Nathaniel began to brush the horse again. Basil broke into Nathaniel's musings. His voice had changed, the enthusiasm over Henry's oratory gone. "How old are you now, lad?" Nathaniel stopped his combing. He hadn't thought about that in the longest time. If it were April— "What month is it, master?" he asked. "April, mid-through." "I?" Nathaniel suddenly remembered small celebrations of his birthday. His mother finding honey to make sweet cakes, her hugging him and whispering that the day of its birth had been the most glorious of her life. Even his father had managed a few compliments that day, led by her example. He had always wanted to please her. A new thought came to Nathaniel about his father, a thought that made him freeze mid-stroke. Would his father ever consider running from his indentureship, as John and Obijah had? If he did, would he come take Nathaniel? In a torrent of confusion, Nathaniel looked at Basil. Would such liberty be worth the price of leaving Basil, his books, his music? Basil's voice barely came to Nathaniel through the storm suddenly raging in his mind. "How old are you, lad?" Nathaniel merely stared. "Nathaniel?" Basil prompted. His father would never come. Never. Why would he? Nathaniel shook off the idea and tried to focus on Basil. "Excuse me, sir? I asked how old you are." "Oh, 14, master. Just on the 4th of this month." The day had passed without Nathaniel even recognizing it. "Well, happy birthday, lad," Basil said happily. Then in hushed voice he added, "I am glad you are so young." "Why, master?" "We may be washed in blood, lad, if it comes to war. King George has thousands of well-trained troops, plus Hessians he purchased from German princes. Those mercenary soldiers are ruthless. We have but a handful of militia, only a few of them experienced, and that in the French and Indian War, mostly under British commanders. There was a great deal of discussion about this last night at the Raleigh Tavern. No one knows who we'd have to command an army against the British. Take George Washington, for instance. He's the Virginian with the most battle experience. He fought in the French and Indian War, but he has never led more than a regiment. The British army thought so little of him that they refused to give him an officer's commission. But, Basil added, there are several men there last night who said that Washington has a calm courage about him that they would follow straight into Hades. Basil sighed. Most of our fighters will be farmers and yeomen. You, thank the Lord, will be too young to bear a gun. The one to worry on is Ben. If I know that hothead, he's already plotting how to get his hands on a musket. Ben had, in fact, discussed the very same several nights back with some of the boys from the bonfire. Ben had gathered them in the stable, including Nathaniel, as if he were sure to want to join in. Ben had said the gunpowder magazine housed plenty of muskets and that no one would notice if they took a few. He joked about dressing up like Indians as they had in the Boston Tea Party to raid the magazine, which the boys laughed about excitedly. That's when Nathaniel left with the excuse of feeding the chickens. He didn't want any part of stealing muskets. Basil shook his head in disapproval of Ben. You keep an eye on our young friend, Nathaniel. He's too impetuous. He knows not what war means. As rousing as Mr. Henry's words are, as just as is our cause, I do wish, mayhap let us hope, that Mr. Henry has been premature in his warnings. But Patrick Henry was not, at that very moment, Riders were galloping south from Massachusetts, spreading the news of a deadly skirmish between American Minutemen and British troops at Lexington and Concord. That night, Lord Dunmore and 20 Royal Marines struck against the people of Williamsburg. Chapter 21. Flam, 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 flam. Nathaniel's eyes popped open. What was that sound? He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and strained to see through the darkness. Across the room, Basil snorted, still slumbering. He must have been dreaming, or Basil's snores had awoken him, as they so often had during the winter. He turned over. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, flam, 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 flam. Nathaniel sat up. Those were drums. He jumped out of bed and ran to the window. In the waning moonlight, he saw men running down the street toward Market Square. Alarm! Alarm! Scanning the rooftops, Nathaniel looked for flames. When a house caught fire, townspeople rushed to pass buckets of water to prevent flames from spreading and burning down entire blocks of buildings. But he saw none. The redcoats! The redcoats! Rat-a-tat-tat! More drums! More shouts! Nathaniel scrambled to pull on his stockings and breeches. "Master!" he called. "Master Basil, something is amiss. Get up!" What's the matter, lad? Go back to sleep." Basil groaned and stretched and rolled over with another snort. Nathaniel could hear Eden and Mrs. McGuire stirring downstairs. He'd have to hurry the old man so that he could get out of the house before Eden might prevent it. He pushed on Basil's turned back. "Master, I think we've been attacked. Master, you must get up." Flam, 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 flam. "To arms, Williamsburg! To the magazine! Alarm! Alarm!" "Master Basil!" Nathaniel pleaded. Basil propped himself up. "What is it?" Rolling drums answered before Nathaniel could. "Good Lord!" Basil tumbled out of the bed. "Grab my coat, lad!" The two of them clattered out the door, down the stairs, and onto the green as Basil pulled on his clothes. His long gray hair flew about his head as they trotted. Other men dashed by them, stuffing their shirt tails into their breeches as they rushed. Women in nightcaps, wrapped in shawls or blankets, peered out from behind their open front doors. The entire town was up, running, afraid. Nathaniel and Basil joined a crushing crowd in the Duke of Gloucester Street between the magazine and the courthouse. Jostling one another, trying to hear, people shouted questions and answers, anxiety and anger bubbling, building to a boil. "What's the matter? What's happened?" "They've emptied the magazine of our gunpowder." "Who?" "British Marines. They came to town in the night and stole more than 15 barrels of the colony's gunpowder." The man with that information was quickly engulfed, illuminated by dozens of lanterns. He tried to shield his eyes. "What? Say again, man." He repeated the news. It rippled through 100 people, passed by indignant bellows. "But that's ours! To defend ourselves against Indian attacks and slave uprisings, and take over by the Royal British Army." "That's right! Let's after them!" "Aye! Aye!" The crowd erupted into a guttural chant. Many in the mob carried muskets, gardening hoes, workmen's axes, whatever they had been able to grab as they raced to the alarm. They held them in the air and shook them threateningly, knocking one another about in their excitement. Nathaniel was nearly squashed by a bull of a man beside him. He instinctively grabbed for Basil's coat sleeve, but Basil had been washed aside in the storm surge of infuriated people pushing roughly to be on the move. A shrill voice kept calling until it finally stilled the mob. "Wait! Wait! It's too late!" It was the same man. Again he became the center of a swarm. "They've already made it back to Magdalen at Burwell's Landing." "How say you?" Frustrated calls of "We can't hear! What did he say?" echoed through the multitude. He held his hands up imploringly, and the crowd gradually silenced. "This was a well-planned theft, lads. He knew our watchmen had gone home to their beds, the lazy sots. He had the schooner and the Marines waiting." "He? Who?" Lord Dunmore! He must have ordered it. He has the key to the magazine gate. They used his wagon and came from the palace stable yard. Mayhap he had the Marines there for days, waiting for the right opportunity. It's obviously to prevent us from arming, as Patrick Henry called for." At this the crowd roared. Dawn was breaking, and its gentle light fell on faces clouded with disbelief and disappointment, faces twisted in rage and vengeance. "Treacherous villain! To the palace! Dunmore will answer for this. We'll hold him hostage until he orders the powder's return. Aye, let's to it!" Reignited, the mob bumped and shoved and turned itself to march toward the palace. Gathering on the green with muskets in hand was Williamsburg's company of volunteers, organized the previous year to fight with Dunmore against the Shawnee. Shouldering their muskets, they too moved forward to join up against the man who so recently led them. "Nathaniel, come here, boy!" Basil and Nathaniel swam toward each other, elbowed and pushed. They fell together, and Basil dragged them out of the tide of rushing people. "Good God!" muttered Basil. "I think we might witness an assassination. If this gets any more out of hand, we must back out of it, lad. Who's to say that Dunmore hasn't fortified himself with armed Marines? From behind this wall they could shoot into the crowd and slaughter dozens." Just as Basil spoke, Nathaniel spotted Ben at the mob's tail end. Pointing, he called out to him, "Ben, come back!" Ben waved before he squirmed his way further into the crowd, his excited grin plain to see. As the feverish horde began to gain direction and speed, a refined voice called out, "Peace! Hold! Stand down, gentlemen!" Voices echoed the call to hold, and the crowd paused, looking back toward the courthouse. On its brick steps stood 3 men. "Shh! It's Peyton Randolph! Quiet, lads! Listen to Mr. Randolph!" The crowd slowly shushed itself. Basil and Nathaniel inched to the crowd's perimeter. "Who are the other 2 gentlemen, master?" Nathaniel whispered. Basil stood on his tiptoes to see. Major John Dixon and the colony's treasurer, Robert Carter Nicholas. Cool heads boast. Let us listen. "Write a petition asking for return of the gunpowder," Randolph was saying. "Nay, we've petitioned enough," a man with a musket shouted. "Patrick Henry is right. Parliament never listens. Look how they hold down Boston. Parliament has already declared Massachusetts in rebellion and clearly plans to crush it. Virginia might be next. Maybe that's what this gunpowder theft is leading up to." "Aye, aye," murmured many. "Maybe. Yes, maybe so. Maybe more Marines are marching toward us right now to occupy our city." Panic crackled through the mob like heat lightning through a summer sky. Peyton Randolph held his ground. This is not Massachusetts, and this petition is not going to Parliament. Accustomed to unruly debate in the House of Burgesses, Peyton remained composed despite the heckling. "This is to a governor many of you know personally." "That we do. We know him as a scurrilous drinker and bore." A few men laughed. Randolph ignored them. "Give us leave to write a petition and deliver it to the governor immediately." "Never mind more paper and polite niceties," countered another man. "Let us take the governor before he slips away to a ship as well." "He will not desert his wife and children," answered Mayor Dixon, playing off the popularity of Lady Dunmore. The crowd mumbled and argued among itself until finally one man shouted, "Gentlemen, Mr. Randolph is about to leave for the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia as our representative. That august body of leaders from all 13 colonies has elected him their president. I think we can trust Mr. Randolph and our town councilors to pen a persuasive petition to Governor Dunmore." Randolph and the man bowed at each other. "What say you?" For a moment there was silence. Then several seconded the motion, persuading the rest. Randolph and Dixon withdrew into the courthouse to write hastily. The crowd remained rooted, watching the courthouse doors like a cat at a mouse hole. Chapter 22. I can't believe they are writing yet another petition. Ben found his way through the mob to Basil and Nathaniel. He was trailed by 4 boys, including the foul-tempered Jeremiah. They were impatient and itchy, like horses denied their morning feed, thought Nathaniel. He nervously realized that Eden's carriage horse was probably twitching about in her stall, wondering where he was with her oats. Haven't they figured out that their petitions and arguments only give the redcoats more time to plot? Ben fussed. Words are the weak weapons of fat old men. His friends laughed. The boy named Beverly chimed in. They probably are in there napping for all the courage they have. Frowning, Basil turned on Ben and spoke with uncharacteristic vehemence. For shame, Ben, for shame, Beverly. Is not your father inside as well? Beverly hung his head, but Ben sighed and rolled his eyes. His reaction infuriated Basil. He caught Ben up by a buttonhole of his coat. These men have risked the hangman for years with their words, and it is their words that have inspired all of us to believe enough in our rights as human beings to speak up and demand justice. For generations, nay, centuries, mankind has held that we must do the bidding of a king, no matter how idiotic or tyrannous he was. Words have taught us that he is, how did Mr. Jefferson put it? Basil hesitated a moment, then went on, that kings are the servants, not the proprietors of the people. This crowd is born of such words, ennobled by such words. I am no longer just a poor musician, a lowly servant because of words. I am a man guaranteed by my very nature to have rights, to have dignity. I stand tall because of words. Basil stopped abruptly, realizing that he had raised a fist and was shaking it at Ben. Ben's chin was lifted, his eyes rebellious. He was grinding his teeth so hard as Basil spoke that his dimples appeared and disappeared repeatedly. He was obviously aware that whoever was near enough to hear was listening to Basil chastise him. Basil dropped his hand but ended forcefully, If Mr. Randolph wants to pen a few more words, I am for it. We owe him that respect, Ben. At that moment, Randolph, Dixon, Nicholas, and several other town aldermen emerged. Ben had opened his mouth to make some retort, but upon seeing them, turned expectantly toward the steps of the courthouse. So did everyone in the crowd. Mr. Dixon began to read, and it was immediately obvious that the mob's reaction would be a mixture of Basil's and Ben's. We, His Majesty's dutiful and loyal subjects. I'm not feeling the mite bit dutiful meself right now, sneered a listener. Shh! Listen, his neighbor elbowed him. Humbly beg leave to represent your excellency. Excellency of what? Deceit? Heckled another. That the inhabitants of the city were this morning exceedingly alarmed. Now there is a fact that a large quantity of gunpowder was, while they were sleeping in their beds, removed from the public magazine and conveyed on board one of His Majesty's armed vessels. Yes, that's right. Well said. Heads began to nod. We therefore humbly desire to be informed by your excellency upon what motives and for what particular purpose the powder has been carried off in such manner. If that's not an act of war, what is? And we earnestly request your excellency to order it to be immediately returned to this magazine. Dixon ended, looking up and squinting into the now bright morning sunshine. Come, friends, Mr. Randolph called. Without waiting for a response, he and the other officials began walking to the palace. The independent company of volunteers fell in behind them. Silenced by their belief in Randolph, the crowd followed dutifully. It came to a halt in front of the Wythe and McGuire houses. The town officials went on alone to the palace gate and disappeared inside. Nathaniel saw Eden and Mrs. McGuire standing on their front stoop and slipped behind Basil to hide from view. He knew from Eden's scowl that he would punish Nathaniel for being part of this march if spotted. He looked for Ben to forewarn him, but Ben had disappeared with his friends. That petition should have had a little more teeth to it. grumbled a well-dressed man standing beside Basil. Remember the proverb, sir, civility costs nothing, Basil murmured. True, the gentleman tipped his hat to Basil, but here's another. Blessed is he who expects nothing, for he shall never be disappointed. Dunmore will not return the gunpowder. I've hunted with him and gamed with him. He stops at nothing to win. I would not be surprised to learn he cheats at cards. He also has a terrible temper. If anything, he will see this mildly worded petition as an insult. 'Twould be better to grab him by the throat and shake the powder out of him. The man turned out to be right. Acting almost as if it was beneath him to answer, Lord Dunmore stated he had taken the gunpowder to protect it from being stolen by slaves. Dunmore claimed there was a slave uprising brewing in nearby Chesterfield, Prince Edward, and Surrey counties. His action was merely one of concern for the well-being of the colonists. He continued that the magazine was ill-guarded by the colonists, vulnerable to seizure, and that there had been sightings of slaves around it after dark. That was why he had chosen the middle of the night to clean it out of powder. Dunmore promised, if an emergency arose, that he could return the gunpowder to Williamsburg within half an hour's time. However, for the time being, he said, it would remain aboard ship. Given the fact the townspeople were so upset, Dunmore did not think it wise to put gunpowder into their hands. With that, he dismissed Dixon and his council. It was with some difficulty that Peyton Randolph and Mayor Dixon persuaded the crowd to go home and go about their jobs. But disperse they finally did. Perhaps their anger had been cooled by the wait, their lack of breakfast, and the realization that their only other option was to go ahead and seize the palace and the governor. Despite the company of armed volunteers standing before them and their indignation, the crowd of Williamsburg citizens wasn't quite ready to storm the home of the king's man. But tempers remained hot. That night another crowd gathered when rumors coursed through the town that the Marines from the Magdalen were coming again. Again, when no actual redcoats were seen, the city elders and Mr. Randolph convinced the townspeople to go home. The next morning, Dr. Pasteur made a call to the palace. Enraged with what he called the city's insolent response to his rightful taking of the powder, Dunmore told the doctor that if the town insulted him any more, he would declare freedom to the slaves, arm them, and reduce the city of Williamsburg to ashes. He commanded the doctor to give that message to Peyton Randolph and the town council. I have one spot for the Virginians, and by God I will let them see that I can fight against them. Within hours, most everyone knew of the governor's threat. It was also reported from house to house, from person to person, from shop to shop, that Patrick Henry had collected 150 marksmen and was marching to the capital from Hanover to recapture the stolen gunpowder. See, Bennett said excitedly, a man of action. When he says liberty or death, he means it. Dunmore was completely game for giving Patrick Henry exactly what he asked for if liberty was not to be had. He had renewed his threat to destroy Williamsburg if Henry came any closer than Ruffin's Ferry, 30 miles to the west. No one doubted that the defiant Henry would stick to his word. Likewise, no one doubted that the wrathful Dunmore meant what he said as well. Anxiously, Williamsburg awaited their head-to-head clash. A number of prominent families fled the city. Then, on April 27th, an exhausted rider careened into the city, carrying the report of Lexington and Concord. There, in Massachusetts, 8 days earlier, British General Thomas Gage had ordered 700 redcoats stationed in Boston to march into the countryside to capture colonial stockpiles of weapons. A silversmith named Paul Revere learned of the plot and spread the word that the redcoats were coming. 17 Minutemen flocked to Lexington Green to face off with 10 times their number. Someone fired a shot. After a confused volley, 8 Americans lay dead, 10 wounded. The British continued to Concord, where they destroyed the colonists' depot of weapons and supplies. On their march back to Boston, however, New England patriots dogged them, shooting from behind trees and boulders, 250 British regulars were killed or wounded. The argument between the parent and its child now was sealed with blood. The timing of Dunmore's theft of Virginia's gunpowder with Gage's destruction of Massachusetts' weapons seemed too coordinated to be coincidental. Virginians could no longer deny the inevitable. The war of words was giving way to a war of bullets. The Virginia Gazette summed it up. The sword is now drawn, and God knows when it will be sheathed.